In the South, the origins of criminal discipline are much more entwined with the disciplinary practices perfected under plantation slavery. Texas, like many other southern states, did build a penitentiary, the walls at Huntsville, but it was reserved in the antebellum period exclusively for whites. It was believed that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could only be reached through the flesh. And so in the statutes in the antebellum period, the only punishments prescribed by law for blacks were whipping or hanging. That then falls apart with the Civil War and emancipation. And as, at least in the first years, as the kind of conservatives who led the South out of the Union and to ruin were still kind of in power, they attempted to use the law to kind of reimpose a kind of two-tiered citizenship model with the black codes and so on. And that produced really the first black felon boom in Texas and Southern history in the late 1860s and in the 1870s. The second black felon boom really came about after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s and the 1980s and 90s. But they dealt with that not by sending all these folks who were racking up petty convictions for stealing a pair of shoes or stealing a bag of corn and getting 2 years hard labor for it. Not by sending them to the penitentiary at the walls, but by turning to a loophole in the 13th Amendment that prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude, except, if you read it, after conviction of a crime. And that was really the origins of convict leasing in Texas when they began just hiring out convicts to the highest bidder. Railroad companies, sugar planters especially, the Imperial Sugar Mill and the smokestack at Sugarland, became a Fortune 500 company, but its origins was, that whole industry was revitalized after slavery with convict labor. Parts of the Capitol, the stone cutting as well as the ironwork, were built by prisoners. Texas's first transcontinental rail links that opened up new areas to agriculture and helped propel the second cotton boom of the late 19th century were largely built by convicts, or wages were held down by convict strike breakers. So this was a system that was enormously profitable, and yet it had ghastly effects because the lessees were able to maximize their profit by spending as little as possible on the upkeep of the prisoners and extracting from them as much labor as they possibly could. And as a result, thousands of people were literally worked to death, buried in the railroad tracks, buried along the shores of the Colorado and the Brazos River down as it empties into the Gulf, and in other areas. Because of the agrarian revolt and church leaders and women's leaders and populists as well as progressives, convict leasing was finally abolished about half a century after it began, finally shut down completely in Texas in 1912. That was a moment when reformers thought Texas would really kind of adopt the northern treatment kind of model of corrections, but instead kind of penny pinching carried the day, as it often does. And Texas really ended up just kind of taking over these same properties. Many of the facilities are still with us in these properties, Eastham, Ramsey, the Central Unit. A lot of these properties were originally slave plantations, then they were leasing plantations, and then they became state plantations. And that style of prisoner management that had been forged in convict leasing and whose own models had been passed down from slavery really continued deep into the 20th century. And really nowhere else in the United States did you have the old slave songs still being sung, gang and task system of labor management without any pay whatsoever, the kind of demeaning as well as the deferential nomenclature of the prison, the kind of insular white guard culture centered around some of these communities. And that finally then, that made Texas among corrections professionals be regarded as a kind of backwater for most of the 20th century. But then that suddenly starts to change in the second half of the 20th century, which is really how we kind of get to where we are now for a couple of reasons. First of all, Texas, unlike Arkansas or Mississippi or other places, under the leadership of O.B. Ellis and George Beto, transformed the plantation penal system to be more palatable for export. They introduced schooling and programs and so on, although they maintained the core kind of agricultural and racially divisive function. But it got Ellis and then Beto both elected president of the American Corrections Association in the latter third of the 20th century. But a more profound shift really explains, I think, the way that Southern justice really becomes American justice in this period, and that's a political transformation that is entwined more than anything with the history of civil rights and the backlash against civil rights.